When you hear the word whipping from the Middle Ages, you probably think of punishment. And you're right, that was a huge part of it. Whipping was a common tool of justice, used for all sorts of reasons. It was brutal, public, and meant to send a message. Imagine a medieval town. There's a square in the center. It's not just for selling vegetables, it's the heart of public life. And in that square, you'd often find a whipping post. This wasn't hidden away, it was right there for everyone to see. When someone was sentenced to a whipping, it was a public event. People would gather to watch, children, merchants, priests, everyone. The person being punished would be tied to the post. Their back would be bare. Then the official, maybe a bailiff or a town guard, would do the job. The tool used could vary. Sometimes it was a single leather strap, other times it was a bundle of birch rods, which would cut and sting the skin. And then there was the scourge, a whip with multiple lashes. Sometimes these lashes had knots tied in them, or even bits of metal or bone to make the punishment more severe. The pain was intense, but the pain was only part of the punishment. The other part was shame. Being whipped in public was deeply humiliating. You were being treated like an animal in front of your neighbors, your family, your customers. That shame would stick with you long after the wounds on your back healed. It was a way of marking you as a wrongdoer, of lowering your status in the community. So who got whipped? It was usually for crimes that weren't serious enough for execution, but were too serious for just a fine. Petty theft was a common one. If you stole a loaf of bread or a chicken, you might find yourself at the whipping post. Public drunkenness, fighting, or causing a disturbance could also earn you a lashing. Vagrancy was another. If you were a stranger in town with no work and no place to stay, you might be whipped and then run out of town. It was a harsh way of dealing with poverty and social instability. Whipping was also a tool for maintaining social order and hierarchy. It wasn't just for criminals tried in a court. A master could legally whip his apprentice for being lazy or disobedient. A lord could have a servant whipped for a mistake. In the home, husbands could whip their wives, and parents certainly whipped their children. This wasn't seen as abuse in the way we see it today. It was considered a necessary form of correction. The world was viewed as a strict hierarchy, with God at the top, then the king, then lords, then masters, and so on. Whipping was a physical expression of that power dynamic. It was a way for those in authority to enforce their will on those below them. The number of lashes was often specified. It might be 10 or 20 or 40. The number depended on the severity of the crime. But even a few lashes from a heavy whip could break the skin and cause bleeding. Infection was a constant risk. A sentence of whipping could easily turn into a death sentence if the wounds became infected. So, this first kind of medieval whipping is straightforward. It was a tool of the state, the community, and the household. It was about pain and shame. It was meant to deter others from committing the same crime. Seeing someone bloodied and screaming at the post was a powerful warning. It was a raw, physical form of justice designed to keep people in line in a world that often felt chaotic and dangerous. It was a fundamental part of the legal and social fabric of the time. But this is only one side of the story. Whipping had another very different meaning in the Middle Ages, one that had nothing to do with crime and everything to do with God. But whipping wasn't just for criminals. It wasn't always a punishment forced upon someone. In the medieval world, many people chose to be whipped, or they chose to whip themselves. This wasn't about justice in a town square. This was about faith. It was a private spiritual act known as penance or asceticism. To understand this, you have to understand the medieval view of the body and soul. They believed the soul was pure and eternal, a gift from God. The body, on the other hand, was seen as weak, sinful, and temporary. It was the source of temptation. Lust, gluttony, laziness, pride, all these sins were tied to the body and its desires. So to save your soul, you had to control your body. You had to discipline it, master it, and sometimes punish it. This idea was called mortification of the flesh. It means, quite literally, making the flesh dead. By inflicting pain on the body, a person believed they could weaken its sinful urges and strengthen their soul. It was a spiritual workout. Just as a soldier trained his body for battle, a devout Christian would train their soul by fighting against the body. The ultimate example of this was Jesus Christ himself. The Gospels describe how he was scourged by the Roman soldiers before his crucifixion. His suffering was seen as the ultimate act of love and sacrifice, the act that redeemed humanity's sins. For a medieval Christian, imitating Christ was the highest calling, and one way to imitate his suffering was to experience the same kind of pain he did. By whipping themselves, people felt they were sharing in Christ's passion. It was a way to feel closer to him, to understand his sacrifice on a deep physical level. This practice was especially common among the most devout people, like monks, nuns, and saints. In the quiet of their monastery cells, they would use a special kind of whip on themselves. It was often called a discipline. It was usually a small whip made of knotted cords. They would strike their own backs or shoulders while praying, often reciting psalms. This wasn't about wild, uncontrolled violence, it was a structured ritualistic practice. Famous religious figures were known for it. Peter Damian, an influential cardinal in the 11th century, was a strong promoter of self-flagellation as a form of penance. He argued it was a powerful way to atone for sins. St. Francis of Assisi, known for his love of animals and poverty, also practiced severe forms of self-punishment to subdue his body. The stories of saints were filled with tales of their ascetic practices, including whipping, wearing hair shirts that irritated the skin, and fasting for long periods. These acts were seen as heroic, as signs of incredible spiritual strength and devotion. For the average person, this kind of penance might be assigned by a priest during confession. If you confess a serious sin, the priest might tell you to fast, say a certain number of prayers, and maybe even to have yourself whipped or to whip yourself. It was a way of paying the debt for your sin. The pain was a physical payment that hopefully would cleanse your soul and earn God's forgiveness. This might seem strange to us now. We tend to see pain as something to be avoided at all costs. But in the medieval mindset, pain had a purpose. It could be redemptive, it could purify. It could be a bridge between the human and the divine. Physical suffering on earth was seen as a way to avoid eternal suffering in hell. A few moments of pain now were a small price to pay for an eternity of bliss in heaven. So this second kind of whipping was the complete opposite of the first. It wasn't about public shame, but private devotion. It wasn't forced on you by a judge, but chosen by you as an act of faith. It wasn't a sign of being a criminal, but a sign of being a dedicated Christian. It was a deeply personal spiritual tool used in the constant struggle between the body and the soul. And sometimes, this private, personal act would spill out into the open and become something else entirely, a mass movement that swept across Europe. Sometimes, this private act of penance went public, and it got big. The most dramatic example of this was the Flagellant movement. This wasn't just a few monks in a cell. This was thousands of ordinary people marching through towns and whipping themselves in a massive public spectacle. The movement really took off in the mid-14th century, right around the time of the Black Death. This was one of the most terrifying periods in European history. The plague was unstoppable. It killed rich and poor, young and old. It could wipe out half the population of a town in a matter of months. No one knew what caused it. To the medieval mind, there was only one possible explanation: God was angry. The plague was a divine punishment for the sins of humanity. People were desperate. They prayed, they went to church, they held processions, but the plague raged on. In this atmosphere of fear and helplessness, the Flagellant movement emerged. It started in Germany and quickly spread across Europe. In groups of people, sometimes hundreds, or even thousands strong, would form processions and travel from town to town. It was a powerful sight. The Flagellants would march in two lines wearing white robes, often with their faces covered by hoods. They sang hymns and chanted prayers. They carried crosses and banners, and they carried whips. These weren't the small disciplines of monks. These were heavy scourges, often with leather thongs tipped with iron spikes. When the procession reached the town's main square, the real ritual would begin. They would form a large circle. Then, on a signal from their leader, they would strip to the waist. They would lie on the ground in the shape of a cross, accepting their symbolic punishment for different sins. Then they would rise and begin to whip themselves. They would strike their own backs and chests, over and over in a steady rhythm. The sound of the whips cracking through the air would echo through the square. They would cry out to God for mercy, for an end to the plague. They would circle the square, still whipping themselves, blood streaming down their backs. This would go on for a long time, sometimes for hours. The townspeople would watch, some in awe, some in horror. They believed these people were incredibly holy, that their extreme suffering might be enough to appease God's wrath and save their town from the plague. The blood of the Flagellants was sometimes collected by onlookers, who treated it like the relic of a saint. The Flagellants had a strict code of conduct. They were supposed to remain in the movement for 33.5 days, 1 day for each year of Christ's life on earth. They were not allowed to speak to women, bathe, or change their clothes. They were led by a laymaster, not a priest. This last part was important, and it's where they started to run into trouble. At first, the church was somewhat tolerant of the movement. It seemed like an extreme, but understandable expression of piety in a time of crisis. But soon, the clergy became suspicious. The Flagellants were operating outside the church's authority. Their leaders were not priests. They claimed they could achieve forgiveness for sins directly from God through their own suffering. This bypassed the whole system of confession, priests, and the sacraments, which was the foundation of the church's power. Some flagellant groups also became radical. They started attacking clergy who criticized them. They began to preach that their own movement was more important than the church itself. And in some places, their religious fervor boiled over into violence against Jewish communities, who were often used as scapegoats for the plague. This was too much for the Pope. In 1349, Pope Clement VI condemned the Flagellant movement. He declared them heretics. He ordered church and secular leaders to suppress them. The movement was driven underground. The public processions stopped. The Flagellants, who had been seen as saints just a year before, were now hunted as dangerous fanatics. The flagellant movement was a short-lived but intense phenomenon. It shows how the idea of penitential whipping could explode from a private spiritual practice into a massive social and political force. It was born out of terror and a desperate desire to find meaning and control in a world that seemed to be ending. It was a stark example of how, in the medieval world, the line between extreme piety and heresy could be very thin indeed. So we have whipping for crime and whipping for God. But let's look closer at how it worked as part of the legal system. It wasn't just random violence, it was a structured and surprisingly regulated part of law and order. It was a tool for maintaining not just the peace, but the very social structure of the time. The whipping post, as we've said, was a public fixture. Its presence in the town square was a constant, visible reminder of the consequences of breaking the law. But the process wasn't usually a mob action. It was a formal sentence, handed down by a legitimate authority, like a magistrate or a manorial court. There was a legal process, however basic it might seem to us. A person was accused, there was some form of trial or hearing, and then a sentence was pronounced. The law often specified which crimes deserved a whipping. In England, for example, laws were passed that specifically mandated whipping for vagabonds or sturdy beggars. The idea was to make life so unpleasant for jobless drifters that they would either find work or move on. It was a brutal form of social engineering. Similarly, petty thieves were often sentenced to be hipped at the cart's tail. This meant they were tied to the back of a cart and whipped as it was slowly pulled through the main streets of the town. This maximized the public humiliation and served as a walking, screaming warning to others. The number of lashes was also part of the formal sentence. It wasn't left to the whim of the person holding the whip. That a judge might order 10 lashes well laid on. The well laid on part was important. It meant the blows should be hard and effective, not just symbolic taps. The goal was real pain, but there was also a limit. There was a recognition, at least in theory, that the punishment shouldn't kill the person. The biblical limit from Deuteronomy was 40 lashes, which was often interpreted in practice as 39 to be safe. This shows that even within this brutal system, there were rules and traditions. Whipping was also a very clear indicator of your social status. The nobility were almost never whipped. It was considered a degrading, servile punishment. A nobleman who committed a crime might be fined, have his lands confiscated, be exiled, or for a serious crime like treason, be beheaded. Beheading was seen as a more honorable death suitable for a person of high rank. Whipping was for the common folk. It was a punishment for the bodies of peasants, laborers, and the poor. This reinforced the social hierarchy every time it was performed. When a commoner was whipped for stealing from a lord, the message was clear: there are different rules for different people. It physically stamped the authority of the upper classes onto the bodies of the lower classes. It was a way of keeping people in their place. The same applied in the military. A common soldier who deserted or disobeyed an order could be savagely flogged. The cat o' nine tails, a whip with 9 knotted thongs, became infamous in military and naval discipline. An officer who committed a similar offense would face a different kind of punishment, perhaps being stripped of his rank or cashiered from the service. The shame was there, but the physical, degrading pain was reserved for the men in the ranks. Within the church's own legal system, the canon law, whipping also had a place. A priest or monk who broke his vows could be sentenced to a whipping by his abbot or bishop. This was seen as a corrective measure, a form of paternal discipline to bring an errant cleric back onto the right path. It was penance, but it was not voluntary. It was a sentence handed down by a religious superior. So while we might see medieval whipping as just mindless brutality, it was deeply embedded in the legal and social logic of the time. It was a measured punishment, delivered by a recognized authority for specific offenses. It was a tool of public deterrence, and, crucially, it was a way of enforcing and demonstrating the rigid social and class distinctions that defined the medieval world. It was a punishment that was felt and seen on the skin. It's hard for us to get our heads around this today. Our modern world is built on the idea that pain is bad and should be avoided. We have medicine to dull it and laws to prevent people from inflicting it on others. The medieval world saw things very differently. To them, pain wasn't meaningless. It was one of the most meaningful experiences a person could have, and understanding that is key to understanding medieval whipping. For the medieval mind, the physical world and the spiritual world were not separate. They were completely intertwined. What happened to your body had a direct impact on your soul, and vice versa. Pain was a bridge between these two worlds. For the devout monk whipping himself in his cell, the pain in his back was a prayer, a way of speaking directly to God in a language of sacrifice that he believed God understood. The pain was real, immediate, and it made his faith feel real and immediate too. It wasn't an abstract idea, it was something he could feel in his own flesh and blood. For the criminal being whipped in the town square, the pain was also a message. It was a physical payment for a moral wrong. The community believed that a crime created a kind of imbalance, a tear in the social and moral fabric. The whipping was a way to repair that tear. The pain of the criminal was seen as a way of canceling out the harm he had caused. And the public nature of it was crucial. The whole community witnessed the payment being made. Order was visibly restored. The shame that went with it was a way of reteaching the community's values. It was a lesson written on a person's back for everyone to read. This acceptance of pain also came from the harsh realities of everyday life. Life in the Middle Ages was full of pain that we can barely imagine. Disease was rampant. There was no effective anesthesia, childbirth was dangerous, a simple injury could lead to a slow, agonizing death from infection. People lived with a level of physical discomfort and suffering that was simply a part of being alive. So, the idea of using inflicted pain for a specific purpose, whether for justice or for salvation, might not have seemed as strange or extreme to them as it does to us. So what changed? Why did we move away from this? The shift was slow and it happened over centuries. The Renaissance and the Reformation began to change how people thought about religion, the individual, and the world. But the biggest change came with the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Thinkers started to focus on reason, human dignity, and individual rights. They began to argue that public physical punishments like whipping were barbaric and irrational. They weren't just cruel, they were ineffective. They might stop a person from committing a crime out of fear, but they didn't make him a better person. The new idea was that punishment should aim to reform the criminal's mind, not just break his body. This led to the rise of the modern prison system, where criminals were supposed to be isolated, reflect on their crimes, and become productive citizens. This was a massive shift from punishing the body in public to trying to reshape the soul in private. Public spectacles of suffering became seen as uncivilized, something that brutalized the spectators as much as the victim. The idea of shame as a tool of justice also began to fade. The focus shifted to individual conscience and guilt. Of course, whipping didn't disappear overnight. It continued as a judicial punishment in many parts of the world well into the 19th and even 20th centuries. It persisted in navies, in schools, and in homes for a very long time. But the medieval understanding of it was largely lost. It was no longer seen as a spiritual act of piety or a necessary public ritual for restoring cosmic order. It became just a crude and violent method of control. The legacy of medieval whipping is still with us, mostly in our language. We talk about whipping up support or a whipping boy. These phrases are faint echoes of a time when the whip was a real and powerful tool. It was a tool of justice, a tool of faith, and a tool for maintaining a rigid social order. It tells us about a world where pain had a purpose, where the body was a battleground, and where salvation and damnation could be felt on the skin. It was a brutal practice, but to the people of the Middle Ages, it made a kind of terrible sense.